there, I'm Doveri Vesterbye, Director of the ENC and host of the MEDIATIZED EU podcast series. Today's discussion is part of a series of podcasts dedicated to the EU-funded MEDIATIZED EU project, which essentially studies how the media discourses are constructed to foster or to hamper the European project, and how they resonate among the public by focusing on the so-called elite media public triangle, which is part of our extensive methodology. And so today's recording will help our audience, who are presumably policymakers, journalists, academics, maybe some politicians as well, to understand the project's research components, such as media analysis and elite interview analysis of each of the countries. And today we will be talking about Portugal. But before we start and before I get to introduce you, I would just like to, of course, plug our lovely project. So if anyone is watching or listening and are interested in learning more about media, Europeanization, and all these different subjects, all you need to do is go to the website www.mediatized.eu. You can also subscribe to our newsletters. We send around, publications and lots of rather interesting information with regards to media and Europeanization. And of course, if you're a social media user, as we hope you are, then you can log on to Twitter, and we are at mediatized_EU. But let me first start by introducing you and welcoming you on the show. We're here with Sofia José Santos, who is an associate professor at the Portuguese University of Coimbra, and importantly also a researcher at the Center for Social Studies. And you're researching on this project, and we're now arriving at the 28th month, and we've gone through desk research, we've gone through extensive thousands of mining of media outlets and transcripts from television to newspaper to God knows what, and we're at a point in which we're now, after having gone through all of this media, we've arrived to a point in which we're interviewing journalists as well as politicians in order to get a full perspective, and using this Q methodology, which is an essential part of our work. And so let me just start by asking you, what are the key findings of the media analysis in the context of Portugal?
Okay, thank you, Sano. In terms of the country, Portugal, the view on the EU is extremely positive, and what we see is that this positive view is usually depicted in news stories and with greater focus on economic issues than any other issue. And this construction of a positive image of the EU is rather a stable, consensual, and we would say normalized, in the sense of the EU is a given. So it's not highly contested, it's something that is part of our daily lives. And although there is this wider acceptance framework and normalization framework, that doesn't mean that there is no criticism, but the criticism that is presented is usually in not as the end game is the critique, or that the EU is a dead-end project, but that there are challenges that the EU can improve. So criticism is always looking at the silver lining or ways to improve the project. No, not criticism in the sense that we give up and we go look other way around for a similar project. And in terms of these critiques, it's usually not on the news stories. So journalists usually use the same language and the same frames that the official protagonists use. Criticism is mostly presented in opinion articles or in letters to the editors or in opinion editorials. So mostly of the daily coverage is usually positive because it mimetizes the official discourses, so the main sources in terms of information. And if you would like me to map the discourses.
With great pleasure. Okay. That's what we're here for.
So usually the discourses are, in terms of the positive perspective, it's usually focus on fostering development. So the EU fosters Portuguese development, fosters security, not only in terms of the military, but also in terms of health. COVID was a really very clear example that Portugal, there's a clear perception that Portugal by itself would never be able to buy the vaccines. So we were able to protect ourselves because we were in the EU. And the idea of the fundamental values. The EU embodies fundamental values of human rights, and we are part of it. It's a part of our identity to share these values, and so the EU is Portugal is intuitively part of the EU. In terms of the criticism, it's usually come as criticism towards the incoherence of the politics in terms of North and South. In terms of social cohesion, that sometimes social cohesion is dismissed as less important and more focused on macroeconomic issues. And the securitization of migrants, or the insufficient policies towards migrants, and insufficient policy or the securitization that was made to COVID. So bringing security grammars, war grammars to COVID, the battle of COVID. So it was also criticized in the media. The use of this military, because it was not a war, but a pandemic. And so we thought that sticking war grammars to the pandemic was securitizing even more the context. So these were mostly the criticism. And in terms of discourses, we found interesting that this discourse was mostly built upon memory and in a very activation of past imaginaries. So whenever we wanted to say that the EU was bad, or that not being in the EU would be bad for our country, the connotation would go to austerity times of the Troika, or to the authoritarian regime of which we were until 1974, or to underdevelopment status. So everything was very, or if we want, the EU represents or brings us towards democracy, development, prosperity. So everything was done in this continuation of imaginaries.
Did you have any other interesting findings or challenges or anything about the media analysis which you didn't expect?
The media analysis was mostly told us that the Portuguese was much more focused on the discourse on the EU was much more focused on pragmatic issues than on identity issues.
Mm-hmm.
And we interpret this as Portugal being a semi-peripheral country with a history close to the EU in terms of history more in the past and more recent history, so closer to the EU. But clearly the pragmatic factors were the most visible. And I think this is to do with us being a semi-periphery country that benefits directly from being in the EU. And I think the most interesting part from our results is that although Portugal benefits a lot from the EU in terms of economic, it also gives to the EU. So it also hindered or hampered its own economy in order to be integrated as all other countries, and that part has been clearly dismissed as less important, and so we mostly focus on the productive or the positive parts of the EU. And also we don't see, despite the criticism, is within a acceptance framework, wider acceptance framework, and even with the criticism we don't see neither essentialist visions of the EU, neither maximalist visions of the EU. So it's quite balanced. It's like on the one hand, on the other hand, and all the discourses is really balanced. So no anti-EU, no pro-EU, but everything and all the criticism on the EU is with a silver lining of a challenge that can be faced and overcome.
Very interesting. And so that's, of course, related to the media analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But then moving on to our elite interviews, which are the second phase in which we use the Q methodology in order to interview
Mm-hmm.
journalists and politicians as well as other media experts. First of all, how was it to utilize the Q methodology in the case of Portugal? How was it to engage with journalists and media experts and politicians, and what have your main findings been until now?
Okay, So the Q methodology was quite challenging, as possibly to most partners, and at the beginning there was some resistance, but then we could get a fair amount of interviewers to interview. We would like to highlight three main conclusions. I think the first one is a positive one, which is the confirmation, the validation of our media analysis. So there's this normalization of the EU as a given. It's something that is not contested in itself fundamentally. So we can make some criticisms and some improvements, but not a fundamental critique to the EU. There is also this interesting thing that although there's an umbrella of acceptance, we could see nuances concerning you're coming from the left wing, the right wing, or the center. And one of the examples is we usually have this idea that Portugal is on the tail of Europe. And some of facing this metaphor, which can be a metaphor or not, in terms of geography is quite literal, but so when facing this metaphor, this image, the people would have different understandings and different explanations of this metaphor. So they would focus either on geography, saying that it's a given that it's in the tail, or on the politics in the sense that it has no importance, or also reading the tail, they would see this as a positive. So they are in the semi-periphery of the Europe, but also this position can make it to be exceptionally good in building bridges with Brazil or other Latin America. So the periphery would be an asset and not something to be a disadvantage for the country. Or in terms of economy or even security, by being on the tail of Europe in terms of security means that we're not under threat, and so we're more protected. So we could see just this is a literally small glimpse of this idea that the same discourse that we see can have also multiple interpretations coming from different perspectives in terms of political ideology. So the bigger umbrella that we saw is not monolithic or linear. It has lots of nuances and perspectives. That was also interesting to see in the interviews. And a final data, it's that the recovery project, the money that is coming from the EU was labeled from the Portuguese Prime Minister as the bazooka, because it wasn't a huge amount of money. And during our media analysis period, the bazooka was always on the news. So every time was mentioning the bazooka. We were expecting it to be used a lot in the interviews with the media professionals or the political elites, but it wasn't. It simply disappeared from the vocabulary. Never used the bazooka. So we are still in this preliminary results, but that is an intriguing data that we want to delve into in our conclusions. So.
Indeed, that's very interesting, and thank you so much, Sofia, because you managed to give us a quick overlook of the case of Portugal with regards to our data collection, and our project is far from over. We still have general population surveys and several years to go before we'll have the final conclusive or conclusions of the entirety of the project, but it's very, very good to be able to discuss these preliminary findings. So I wanted to first mention that at this point we're trying to stick within the 15 to 20 minute margin, so I think our discussion will come to an end. But before it does, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing these views and analysis, and I will add that I'm Doveri Vesterbye, and this was the MEDIATIZED EU podcast series.
Thank you.